Welcome to this evening's Moot, and coming to you live to you from Spain. And it's perhaps by design as well as by fortune that we're doing the Spanish Inquisition live from Spain. Sue and I have been down in Spain for a week or so now, and this is our sort of second week in Spain. And what was really cool about this, unbeknownst to us, of course, is that when we went to Benidorm for a day trip the other day, we discovered that this was going on, a medieval Spanish market. And you can see there's a very medieval looking gentleman in the front. Not. However, amongst all the stalls and all of the displays, there was lots of things going on that really make reference to what I want to talk to you today about in the Moot. One of the things that we really did enjoy was this particular drum and pipe performance, a bit of which you can see now. Fantastic, wasn't it? Now, one of the things that's interesting here is the eclectic nature of some of the stalls, and actually the fact that really the idea of a Spanish medieval festival or market is a little bit weird in the sense that in medieval times, Spain, as a unified, that more in a moment. But as we look round the stalls, there were the numerous collections of, food and new agey kind of stalls with crystals and stuff, and toy stores and craft stores. But on a number of them, we found markings like this. And here we see on this stall here carved what we know to be the Knights Templar cross, or the cross of St. Christ, the Knights of Christ's cross. And we see Crusader folk duffing up non-Crusader folk. And of course, this is a really important indication that the history of medieval Spain, and indeed medieval Europe, was ruled by feuds between various groups of people, and in particular on a religious front, which we'll talk about more in a moment. So, the Spanish Inquisition, that's the title of tonight's talk, and Spanish Inquisition was an inquisition that lasted from 1478 to about 1834. Now, you may be surprised to realize that it went on well into the 19th century. And really, the Spanish Inquisition was set up to combat heresy in Spain, and it was to also consolidate Spanish power. As I mentioned a moment ago, and early medieval times, Spain was not a unified country as such, and we'll come back to that. Now, the Inquisition was not the Spanish Inquisition, was not the first nor the last, and in many ways, the Inquisition of sorts is continuing, but albeit in a different form, because there are groups within the Vatican deciding what is not heresy. But to understand the Spanish Inquisition and the other Inquisition, we need to look at a bit of a context around the medieval church to see what was going on generally before we look at some of the things that the Spanish Inquisition was accused of doing or being or even becoming. So by the early Middle Ages, the Christian church had got a fairly good, strong monopoly in Europe. Christian doctrine was actually accepted, and certainly by the high Middle Ages, Christian doctrine and politics were linked together, so that you have church states, basically. However, as this power of the church increased in line with the Christian monarchs, the church itself became accused of being corrupt. The priesthood, particularly the church, became very, very wealthy. And it seemed to be that the church may be in danger of moving away from its Christian values or its stated Christian ideologies. And that saw the rise of a number of heretical splinter groups within the Christian church. A number of these splinter groups actually set themselves up to stand against the hypocrisy of the clergy and the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church in particular. And there were 6 or so heresies that are quite important to note around this time, which we'll just talk briefly about now. There were the Paulicians, who were the heretics of the 7th and 9th century, and they advocated a return to the simple Christian life as taught by St. Paul. They believed that communion with God didn't need a priesthood. Now that creates an immediate problem, doesn't it, for the church itself? They rejected the divinity of Christ, that Christ wasn't initially holy, that he was actually mortal. That kind of distinction between a divine Christ and a human Christ becoming godly, if you like, was one of the basic controversies in the early church in the sort of 5th centuries, and had been sort of sorted out by various councils. However, the Paulicians wanted to go back to the idea that Christ wasn't actually divine, and they wanted to believe in 2 powerful deities, one good God and one evil God. So the Paulicians, one group that were causing problems with the church, and the church authorities decided that they would condemn some of these teachings as heretical against the dogma. Bogomils, 11th century, believed that war belonged to an evil deity, and that the purpose of life was to free ourselves from the evil and find the true God. The Bogomils were influenced a lot by the Gnostic teachings. Early Gnosticism maintained that the world was created by an evil god they called the demiurge, and that was we were living in illusion, and behind the demiurge was actually the truth, i.e., God. And the search for knowledge was the search for truth. So the Bogomils had adopted some of those ideas, and they too became a target of the Catholic Church. The Cathars, probably one of the best known heretical groups of the time, 11th to 13th century, from France. The Cathars, their name comes from the Greek word meaning pure ones. They too had dualistic beliefs of good and evil. They were Gnostic, truly Gnostic, in the sense that they venerated the goddess Sophia, who was the goddess of wisdom. And they believed that the church had corrupted wisdom itself. They had corrupted Sophia itself, the nature of Sophia, and therefore they themselves should not be worshipped. Cathars came to a rather sticky end, in the same way that the Knights Templars came to a sticky end when church authorities decreed that they were heretics and needed to be hunted down. The Waldensians, a 12th century heretical group, their founder was a guy called Peter Waldo from France, and they preached the doctrine of simplicity, poverty, and service to others. Again, at the time, the Catholic Church in particular was wealthy, claimed to be giving service, but was also not very simple at all. It was overly complicated with ritual, and of course, all the ritual was going to be in Latin. The founder of the Waldensians, Peter Waldo, paid for the Bible to be translated into local French, and he preached from that, which again was a kind of problem for the church, because once the word in the Bible becomes understandable by the everyday person, the priesthood again start to lose their power. The Lollards were in the 14th century, a bit later, but they were followers of John Wycliffe, who was an Oxford philosopher as well as a priest. Now, John Wycliffe actually was the guy that got the Bible translated into Middle English. So rather like the people before him, the Waldensians, he was preaching from a Bible that was translated into Middle English and was, of course, falling foul of the church. Lollards may derive from the Dutch word for someone who mumbles prayers. Now, if you think about the high church, you think about the ritual in the high church, that was all very, very formal, very, very Latinized, very, very kind of precise, whereas maybe Middle English seemed a little bit more mumbly. Again, the Lollards became a persecuted or heretical group. Fortunately for John Wycliffe, he was protected by Oxford University under academic freedom of expression. So if it hadn't been for that, he may have had other problems. The Hussites in 15th century Germany followed a guy called Ian Jan Hus, who admired Wycliffe, and he really questioned the selling of indulgences. He was tried and burned at the stake in 1415. Indulgences, of course, were what the church used to actually get some money from the sinners. People would pay for forgiveness, and it even goes as far as collecting and paying for specific relics. And these indulgences were the priest's fee for granting salvation. Again, not a very Christian idea. So those six groups were all heretics. They were all heresies. Now, the first known use of the word heresy was in 380 by the Edict of Thessalonica. Um, the Roman Empire decided that some teachings, some um, ideas were outside the agreed dogma and therefore they would be heretical. So in 380, this edict set out the crime of heresy, and it gave the church a mechanism through which it could legally um, pursue what it perceived as heresy, paving the way for for the persecution of those groups we just talked about. The first Christian heretic was actually, shall we say, burned at the stake with his 5 followers in 386. That's 6 years after that law was passed. And Priscillian, he was condemned to death for sorcery. And so he and his 5 followers were burned at the stake. However, Pope Silius and Ambrose of Milan believed that capital punishment was inappropriate at best and usually unequivocally evil. So this meant that Priscillian's accusers themselves became excommunicated after they had burned Priscillian and his followers. There was now a problem, however, and the problem was the church had identified heresy, had made heresy a crime, and the people, the local people, had an appetite for finding heretics. In 1076, Pope Gregory VII excommunicated the residents of Cambrai, which was a commune in France, because a mob had seized and burned a Cathar after the bishop had determined him to be a heretic. So although Cathars by that time were on the cusp of being condemned as heretics, this local bishop took it upon himself to incite the mob to burn this particular Cathar. And the same thing happened in 1145 in Strasbourg when the bishop was away. The local priests and some other people, again mob rule, took aside a particular heretic and decided to burn him. Fortunately, in that case, the bishop and his allies came to the rescue and the guy was saved. But that meant there was a continuing problem that the church were not able to control the mob. The mob had mob rule, and they were seeking authority to rid their area of heretics. So that led to the very first Inquisition, set up in 1184 by Pope Lucius, and it was a response to the Cathars movement, but it actually set aside a provision for bishops to visit their diocese twice a year to search for heretics. But on the back end of that, or if you say the other side of that coin, was that they were not in search of heretics; they were actually stopping the mob taking over. Okay, and so this became bishops given the power to run local inquisitions. Eventually, that gave way in 1233 to what we know as the Papal Inquisition, where Gregory IX tried to find a way of regularizing the persecution of heresy. And it was to ensure that there was order and legality rather than the haphazard way the mob were doing it. And as it turned out, the bishops were doing it. The trial by mob and mob justice was something that was not in the church's mind. It was distasteful to the church. And so Gregory appointed a number of papal inquisitors, they were mostly Franciscan and Dominican monks, to introduce a process. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. From 1233 onwards, we have an inquisitorial process, and that process was recorded and heavily documented for church purposes. And so when we talk about the Inquisition, we often think of these kind of periods of torture, these periods of imprisonment, these periods of execution, which is really not exactly what the due process was. In fact, the positive spin of the Inquisition was actually to ensure that those that accused got a hearing, at least of some kind, and a structured hearing. And many scholars in recent years have decided that the Inquisition actually saved more lives than it actually cost. Now, I'm not trying to excuse anything the Inquisition did in terms of punishing heretics, but I'm just raising the point here that if it was left to mob rule, then it probably would be that more and more heretics would have been killed, because heresy was seen by local people as a disease and a cancer. And so, whilst the intention was to regularize or normalize the inquisitorial process, there was also the sense in which they wanted to have a single dogmatic religious viewpoint being adhered to by the people, and also by the priesthood and by the other tribes. It is important to reiterate what I said a moment ago, that the general population tended to see heresy as a kind of cancer. They saw it as something that was destroying the very fabric of their communities. And so, therefore, there was a passion for finding heretics, even if they were only to be scapegoats for the ills of the community. With the Inquisition coming to regulate that process, there was a possibility that the mob didn't get its way, and people that were trained in theology, who could have theological debates about what was and what wasn't heretical, could actually govern the process. The other thing to bear in mind here is that in the early Inquisitions, most of the people that were brought to trial were Christians. They were Christians who held different beliefs to the Orthodox one of the church. And so the idea of the Inquisition going out and burning witches or pagans or anybody else at the moment, that wasn't the intention of the Inquisition. It was to bring their own people into line. I was interested by a comment I heard somebody else make a few years ago about when we start to see the resurgence of printed magical literature and grimoires and texts from other cultures, the people that would have been able to read those texts would have been priests, because they read Latin and stuff was translated into Latin from the Greek and stuff. And so the priests would have been the first people to really get access to some information that was contrary to Christian dogma, and therefore the church needed to police its own in many respects. So what was this inquisitorial process about? What was the process? Well, the first step of the process was an investigation. The townspeople would be invited to come to a place where the inquisitor was, and they'd offer the opportunity for anybody in the group to admit or confess to their heresy. And if the accuser was able to renounce their heresy, then they were usually forgiven, kind of pat on the head or on the wrist and sent on their way. They would be given leniency. Any accuser would need to be denounced by at least two witnesses. So if the two people denounced somebody who didn't come forward, there needs to be two people that was there. In many cases, many more. So say that you were a heretic, and when you were given the opportunity to confess, you didn't. You risked the wrath of the Inquisition, and then you were grassed up by two or three people. then the Inquisitor would actually start to look at you. And the process was part of a trial, a formalized trial, where the case against the accused would actually be heard. Um, and that in and of itself is fascinating, because if the Inquisitor believed that people were bringing charges out of malice or avarice or greed, uh, then they themselves would be charged, and the charges against the heretic or the accused would be dropped. So the process was very formal, and it was written down. There's evidence in the Vatican libraries of all of the records from all of the formal inquisitions that took place, where you can read what the accusation was, what the accuser said, and what the accused responded. This is far from the mob rule and the incitement to violence that often is associated with the Inquisition. Um, Torture, yeah. So, okay, you haven't confessed and you've been accused, so torture was allowable. But here's the other thing that we are often misled by. As far as the Church Inquisition was concerned, the Papal Inquisition, torture was allowed for short periods of time. In fact, usually no more than 15 minutes. And the torture could not cause loss of life, miscarriage, or loss of too many blood, or much blood, or permanent disfigurement. So all the terrible torture devices that we hear about may not have actually been used by the Inquisition in and of itself. More interestingly, the brutalities that we hear about were not conducted by the Inquisition, but by the secular courts and the mob outside of the church, which is why that's led some people to suggest that a trial by the Inquisition was a better bet than a trial the um, by the mob or by the secular authorities. Um, I think this sheds a different bit of light onto what was going on. Terrible, yes, no argument there. Was terrible, but was it better than the alternative? I'll leave you to think about that one. The process then, after the torture, led to the punishment, and in most cases, the punishment was simply the agreement to repent. Most low-level heretics, once punishment or found guilty, were forced to wear the yellow cross, or the yellow cross tabard, which is what the Cathars were forced to wear, and that would be their punishment. Sometimes it would be a sort of corporal punishment in the stocks, and sometimes it would actually be a punishment that was slightly more severe. But here's the thing: the church never conducted the executions themselves. And in fact, the church didn't conduct the tortures themselves. They brought in external torturers and external, if they needed to, executioners, so that their hands were kept clean. So that's a broad overview of the Inquisitions, full stop. And as you can read about this, that the number of people that were killed in the Inquisition are nowhere near the numbers that we have been led to believe in popular myth. So let's look at the Spanish Inquisition. Just have a slurp. Now, at the time of the early Inquisitions, Spain was not a unified country. It was made up of principalities or kingdoms. And at the time, Spain was both a multiracial and a multireligious country with large Muslim and Jewish populations. So spread through the whole of Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, there were a high number of Muslims and a very large Jewish population. And they coexisted with whatever form of Christianity was there, usually Catholicism. But The dream of a unified Spain meant that it had to find a way of unifying itself under one flag, under one religion, and under one set of beliefs. And so we have a period of time called the Reconquista in Spain. And the Reconquista was gradually the movement of the Muslim population out of the country. This map shows here that the Muslims were forced out of Spain, gradually moving to the south, sort of the southeast to the area named Granada, which was their last stronghold. In fact, if you visit Spain today, the evidence of Moorish or Islamic culture is there, but not in the way that you find it. I suspect that the pipers that you heard before were more Moorish than Spanish, if that makes any sense. Um, Certain of the watchtowers that exist in parts of Spain were originally Moor watchtowers to defend the Moorish people from the sea, which were gradually then taken over by the Spanish kings and queens to keep out the Moors. So the Reconquista was all about the movement of the Moorish people, the Islamic people, out of Spain. This was forced movement. It wasn't volunteered, it was forced movement out of Spain up until that 15th century. Now, the other group of people that were in Spain um, were, were the Jews. And during the time of the Reconquista, um, the Jews were expected to convert to Christianity. Um, they were called in Spanish conversos, i.e., they converted to Christianity. However, there was a sense in which that some of the Jews and Jewish peoples did not convert. They simply pretended to convert, and that gave rise to the need to seek out those that did not truly accept or follow Christian belief. Initially presented with the option of conversion or death, the Jewish people, many converted, and of course, many didn't fully convert or only converted in name and maintained their Jewish belief systems, and they became the focus of the persecutions and the the Inquisitions. Uh, it was a very brutal time in Spain. Um, the Jewish community faced choice between that conversion and death. Those that converted were often suspected of not being fully converted. With the marriage of Edward Ferdinand II and Elizabeth I of Aragon and Castile, it saw a unification of Spain and the idea that these two Catholic monarchs could create a Catholic Spain. And so, because of that desire and because of their influence, Pope Sixtus the Fourth, sorry, that's right, authorized Ferdinand and Isabella to appoint inquisitors to enforce religious conformity and expel the Jews from Spain. This is the start of the Spanish Inquisition in many respects. Um, the It was brutal in the sense that anybody who did not conform to Orthodox Christian belief um, could not be tolerated, basically. I find it really interesting that Christianity, Islam, and Judaism are religions of the book. They share the Old Testament uh, in their religious belief systems, and whereas the Islamic peoples initially would have had no problem with Christians, Christians obviously had a problem with the Islamic people. And so Ferdinand and Isabella, for reasons they believed were sound, tried to create a unified country under a unified flag, under a unified belief system. And they used the Papal Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, to do that. I think we can see today where there are parallels to that happening right now, only not under religious guises, but under political guises. Um, the first inquisitors were so severe in their methods that the Pope Sixtus tried to intervene, but he his authority was not accepted by the king and queen because they realised that in their hands they had a very powerful political tool. And so the whole of the Spanish Inquisition, which is where that Monty Python thing comes from, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. It was characterized by secret procedures, the use of torture during interrogation, more torture than the Inquisition actually would have done normally, and a complete lack of rights for the accused. So, whereas before I said that if you were found by the Inquisition, tried by them, you're probably luckier than secular authorities. I'll take that back when it comes to the Spanish Inquisition, perhaps, because the drive here was about creating a unified country. One of the odd parts of the whole affair was what was known as the auto de fe. Whereas the Inquisition itself, the accusation, the trial, and the torture were very, very closed affairs, the punishments, the sentencing, were very public affairs. And the auto de fe, or acts of faith, were public ceremonies which the sentences against the condemned were read out. They were very elaborate ceremonies with popular spectacles, with processions, oaths of obedience to the Inquisition, and sermons. Notice that, oaths of obedience to the Inquisition. This gives you a hint at how powerful the Inquisition as a body had become. The accused were thereover turned over to secular authorities for punishment. So even if the sentence was death, the auto de fe, the sentencing by the church, didn't do that. They formally handed them over to the secular authorities for the levelling of that punishment, which kind of meant that the church could argue its hands were kept clean. And these auto de fe carried on for some years. The only way I can think about them, I know that we have public executions in Britain where people came out to see the local hangings. Well, these were that, but far more elaborate. They're almost gladiatorial in their kind of flavour and feel. A name that many of you may be familiar with and that might be worth you thinking about is a guy called Thomas de Torquemada. He was really the first head inquisitor. Established in 1478, he actually fundamentally believed, that anybody who did not accept the orthodox word of the church was a wrong 'un and needed to be dealt with. And so he actually organized his inquisitors, the people underneath him, to do just that. The other character who took over in about 1500s was Francisco Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros, and he was the one that really took over the Muslim expulsion of Spain. So whereas Torquemada dealt with the conversos and the Jewish with lots of zeal, it was Cisneros who actually took over moving the Muslims out. It's really difficult to find where this idea of the anti-Semitism came from and comes from, except there is this kind of vibe within certain branches of the Orthodox Church that it was the it was the Jews that crucified Christ, and therefore they're forever damned because of it. I won't dwell on that too long because the whole idea is very distasteful. However, Spain was now Spanish, and it was now uh, under the Catholic faith and an agreed Catholic faith. So the question had to be, who was next? If you've actually got rid of the Jews and the Muslims, who's next? So it started again, the Inquisition, because it was a monster. It had got its own energy and its own power. And because it was a monster, it started to roll of its own accord. So it needed to find new victims. and those new victims were amongst the Catholics themselves. Um, and in many respects, the, the Spanish Inquisition, the model of the Inquisition, actually got set up in Portugal. Now, what we need to look at here is that not only did the church, the Inquisition, actually start looking for other victims or other people to have a go at, this was also the time in which Spain was doing all that outreach stuff. We're talking about the time that perhaps the Knights Templar came into Spain and became the Knights of Christ. And that's why the Knights Templar flag is on the boats that went that travelled the seas to the Americas and Columbus and all that kind of stuff. This was a time at which not only was there intolerance and prejudice within Spain itself, but a very strict rule of church or rule of king and queen, but there was also an expansionism going on. And so the Spanish Empire was also growing. So, what better way to keep dissenters quiet than to have the Spanish Inquisition hanging around, ready to tackle dissenters against the crown as well as against the church? Whilst the Inquisition started to decline into the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, um, it continued right until into the 1800s, where it was revived and then it was suppressed again. Um, and it was revived and suppressed because it was an effective vehicle for maintaining a certain degree of public order. I could possibly suggest there are certain countries now that have, shall we say, secret services or secret police that are doing what the Inquisition did, but using different motives. They're not religious motives anymore, but they are controlling motives. So if we look at the victims of the Spanish Inquisition, we've got estimated numbers killed ranging from 30,000 to 300,000. Horrific numbers. Okay. However, in 2014, or 2004 rather, the Vatican opened up its records office to independent researchers. And for the first time in many years, people from outside the church could start to look at the records kept from the actual Inquisitions. And it suggested that around about 125,000 people were tried as heretics, but only 1% of that were actually executed. And of course, they were executed not by the church, but by the state. There were many, 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 many more executions by the local courts, which were running against what the Inquisition was attempting to do. Again, terrible numbers, not supporting it, but saying we need to get this into a perspective, because like a lot of history, there is a danger of it being retold in ways that support a particular point of view. The pagan community often sees the Spanish Inquisition as being related to witchcraft, and in fact, the Papal Inquisition is to witchcraft, and we need to put a question mark there. You see, the trial of witches wasn't a priority. In fact, it was discouraged by the Inquisition. And even though the church recognised that maybe witches travel to sabbats to have pacts, they really thought that the only way to deal with that was through repentance or confiscation of property rather than death. And so between 1526 and 1611, only 22 people were condemned for sorcery. Only two. I mean, say that it's 22 people nevertheless, but it's not the thousands of people that we hear told about in the burning times, where the idea is that all the blame comes at the Inquisition's door. It doesn't. All of the blame for that terrible things that happened afterwards fall at the secular door, because the church couldn't stop local authorities from conducting witch trials. Um, so the Council of Navarre called for an investigation of witches, led to a number of witches from 5 different places being arrested and executed. That's 1525. That caused the Council of Spanish Inquisition to intervene and force 30 of those individuals to be handed over to them, and all the ongoing trials after that 1525 Council of Navarre were supervised. Again, the church was trying to bring in controls over what the authorities were actually doing. There's a famous Basque witch trial of 1609. Again, a number of people accused of being witchcraft, and it suggests that the number of people in those witch trials were 2,000 or so. Numbers are probably more likely to be around the 1500s, but only 6 people out of that series of witch trials were executed. I mean, 6 is bad enough, but 6 were executed, not the thousands that were actually tried. And I think it's important to bear that in mind when we start to look at if we were to do anything on the witch trials, because the witch trials that we are more familiar with are the witch trials that were outside of the Inquisition. So, yeah, as I said, a small number of people tried. 11 people were executed in the 7,000 witch trials. 5 were burned in effigy, and 6 were burned alive in actuality. The ones that were burned alive in effigy had actually died in prison. Burning was purification, and that's why burning was so important. Now, around about this sort of time, an awful book came out, or an infamous book came out called the Malleus Maleficarum. It came out in 1480 something, 1486, I think. It's the Hammer of the Witches, and it's written by 2 Dominican monks called Kramer and Speyer. If you read it, and you do read it, try to read it neutrally, you'll find that it's actually just full of ranting and ravings, basically. Interestingly, in 1484, Kramer tried to persecute some witches in the Tyrol region, but it wasn't a success. He was thrown out and expelled from Innsbruck by the local bishop as being senile and crazy. However, nevertheless, he went on with Speyer to write this book, The Hammer of the Witches, and that had an incredible impact. Before 1400, it was rare for anybody to be prosecuted for witchcraft. After the publication of this book, more and more people were being identified as being witches and therefore prosecuted, mostly by the secular courts, on the basis of this book. Now, this book had 3 sections to it, basically. The first section was a philosophical debate as to the existence of witches. The second section was how to find witches, and the third section was basically how to punish them. And in this book, that's where we read of these depraved, violent, I can't even bring words to it, tortures that the secular courts were accused of and actually did partake in. And what's interesting about the Malleus Maleficarum is that at the front of the book, there is a letter, apparently from a pope, endorsing the book, saying that these 2 guys have actually done this work and this book should be endorsed and shared, and it fully fitted with Catholic doctrine. In fact, that book, that endorsement at the front of the book, was a fake. It's been later been shown to be a fake. And Kramer himself ended up being condemned by the Inquisition in 1490 as being heretical and against the faith. So the book that started the witch trials, and in fact fueled the witch trials, actually was written by a guy that himself was seen initially as senile and crazy, and lastly was excommunicated and subject to the Inquisition himself for the things that he was writing. And that's an interesting perspective. You see, in Britain, we know about witch finders like Matthew Hopkins, and these witch finders had no state or religious authority. They took it upon themselves to be public witch finders and were paid by the courts. And it was a business. And that's the thing that was so sick about the witch trials in many respects, that some of these people had no authority but set themselves up. They got out a copy of the Malleus and used the Malleus as a literal piece of work. And what do we get? We get the terrible stuff that has been called the witch burning trials, the witch persecutions. Um, in Britain, it would have been the hanging times, because witches in Britain weren't burned, they were hung. That was a state punishment. Now, something come up when I was looking at this, and I'm offering it here for you to just reflect upon. There's a lot of material here that you can read, and if you can follow up if you want to. But it seems to be that there is a movement, and it's not about being an apologist. It's trying to see what the history is saying, that the church's inquisitions were nowhere near as brutal as made out. And of course, they were absolved in a way from any of the executions because they didn't do them. The secular courts did them. So when the church can quite honestly turn around and say, it wasn't us, God honest, we didn't burn these people, but they set the conditions up in which they could be executed. But there's another side to this. Spain, as I mentioned earlier, at this particular time was expanding. And what do we know from the history of countries? Countries that are in expansion, building empires, either you get on with those countries or you don't get on with those countries. And the number of scholars, and in particular people like Ronald Hutton, who have looked at this, are actually saying, well, actually, we've got to be aware of something called the Black Legend. The Black Legend is a propaganda exercise aimed at Spain to make Spain look uncivilized, violent, and, shall we say, barbaric, and more violent, more barbaric than the other countries in Europe at the time, which I find difficult to believe because they were all doing the same kind of thing. But what is interesting is that if I was to say to anybody who'd not listened to this talk so far, what do you know about the Inquisition? The very first thing that would come to mind would be torture, executions, and all that dark, violent stuff. If you look at the Inquisition in a more balanced way, you see, whether you agree with it or not, it was an attempt to create a process. And so the Black Legend is this idea, this hypothesis, that really most of the common knowledge, and we know what common knowledge is, don't we? It's an excuse for not doing the research. We rely on common knowledge. Most of the common knowledge is based upon a publicity campaign against Spain in particular. Um, I think that this is worth looking at. As Ronald Hutton has said, um, it could be taken to see that other countries, other rulers, other kings, queens were using the propaganda of this dark period of Spanish history and making the Spanish look far more unenlightened, and actually then setting up an us and them situation. Now, I know there's been a lot in this presentation, a lot for you to think about. I would suggest you go back and look and read the slides. There's more information on the slides than I actually gave, because I believe that one of the reasons of recording this and saving it for you is that you can go back and you can actually have a proper look. I'm not sure where I stand on the Spanish Inquisition at the moment. Uh, I think it's possibly no worse than any other religious fanatical group, and we have to question ourselves whether we choose to pick one country and one group of people to vilify, and therefore stop looking at our own misdeeds and look at the things that we were involved with. I think the witch trials themselves would make an interesting topic for another talk, especially the European witch trials, especially British witch trials. And we will discover, and you will discover, that most of those witch trials were secular in nature. They were about state, and they used the church to back them up, but they're about state. Whereas the Inquisitions were about church, who may have been misused by state. So, what do you think? It's over to you. Let you have a think about it, and I'm happy to have a discussion about it sometime, and happy to hear your thoughts. So drop me an email, and happy to be corrected on anything because, as I say in all of these things, I only know what I know now. I may read something tomorrow which will change my mind completely. So don't take anything I've said to you as fact. Take it as a work in progress, an understanding in progress, which in fact is what learning is all about. So our next moot, well, we're coming into June the 10th, and that's the month in which we get the summer solstice. So I thought maybe we'd have a look at solar deities and the range of solar deities and solar traditions. Um, not all solar deities are male, for example, and we look at that in particular, and we try and look at some of the stories behind solar deities, and again look behind the history of some of the things that modern pagans accept as being the only reality. In fact, look at some of the dogma that many modern pagans, Wiccans, whatever, hold as their particular truth and the thing that they would call heresy. Okay, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Over to our chats.